Thank you. Sarah, you wanted to come in very briefly?
Yes, just very briefly, thank you, Chair. I just want to say, obviously this is incredibly complicated. If the government keeps going ahead on this process, they've set this 1 million threshold. What would be a more realistic threshold that would at least try and offset some of this, if they were to be able to move that band at all?
I'm afraid the answer starts with the question, what is the object of the threshold? If the object is a small family farm, and if we take that as a farm that produces a livelihood and will contain significant owned land, then you are looking at having to increase that threshold quite markedly. It will vary between sectors. So again, I have most recently been looking at Northern Irish figures for a reason to do with yesterday, but you would be looking at an average value of a cereals farm there probably being 6 million, a dairy farm probably 4 for those capable of meeting those tests. And that's including machinery and livestock and so on for the different types of farm. And then it would be a question of working around that as to what I'm referring back because that would be a matter of the policy objective, but it would be that data that would be where you would start if you were trying to be protecting once you've decided what a small family farm is, if you're trying to do that, then that's where you would get to.
So, as a quantitative person, I'd want to look a bit more at the data that we have from HMRC, referring to my earlier answer. Yeah. I think that the stated objective of this relief is to protect small family farms and stop the breakup of small family farms. That was the reason the relief was introduced. And so I think it's important to understand, actually, again, what are the liquidity constraints that those farms face, and trying to find out where would a threshold be that would be consistent with that. But I think it's really important to start from that and to remember that in the current form, the way the relief has been structured until since 1995, is one in which actually the relief has driven up the cost of land in a way that's actually not effective, not supporting genuine farmers, because it makes that land more expensive for them. So I think that's the reason why a reform is certainly necessary. I think it's just about where you set that threshold. I think it's a really important question. I think we're certainly doing further work. I'm happy to provide that to committee when we've done that.
This is a question of a non-structural relief for an economic or social purpose. Dr. Vanny, just before we move on.
Exactly.
Sarah, you have questions on the legal implications.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, well, I think, Stuart, as you were mentioning, I think this is many expected to die in the saddles, so they haven't really been making their plans. But what do you think steps, and I'm not asking for legal advice because I know it's very specific, but what sort of legal steps do you think farmers might now try and take to lessen their inheritance tax burden in the future?
So an awful lot. The first thing people are going to need to do is change their wills. The fact that the proposed £1 million isn't transferable seems peculiar because it just puts an additional burden on people, meaning that they've got to change their wills either to leave something down a generation early or to put some sort of complex trust structure in place to capture that relief in order to achieve the numbers that, to be frank, some ministers have been glibly talking about, the 3 million. That's not achievable without some complex tax planning in place involving changing wills, putting structures in place. People are going to be needing to redraft partnership agreements to bring in next generations. Most farms tend to farm in partnership rather than using companies. So they're going to need to be updated. They often haven't been looked at if they exist in the last 30 years. There are certainly people in Norfolk who have partnerships based on a handshake done in 1950. They are going to be trying to move land between generations. That creates a real problem when it comes to the charges that are already in place. So if you're charged to a bank because you've got some borrowings, which is fairly common, then you can't give that land down to the next generation, even if they're in partnership with you, without getting bank consent. And banks often take that as an opportunity to reset their charges, to recharge all the refinancing and the legal processes involved in all of that as well. You're then going to be looking at prenuptial and postnuptial agreements, depending upon whether the next generation is married. Every farmer I've ever spoken to has a horror story about someone they know who got divorced and lost the farm, and therefore they are rightly paranoid about the risk of that, and therefore making sure that the farm is secure to pass down to their children, who may well have been working on it for the last 30, 40 years with low pay, because they're expecting to pick this up, and now that they're worried that they won't. So extensive. And this pivots back to what we were talking about earlier about people being affected. I think it's potentially a little disingenuous to say that people are only affected if they end up paying tax. If in order to avoid paying tax, they've had to accrue thousands, if not tens of thousands of legal fees, financial fees, land agents, accountants and valuers in trying to achieve a new structure that is tolerable to them and their personal circumstances. Even with all that, the people who are going to be really caught by this are those who die early, those who can't plan, those who are unfortunate. And by any measure, that has to be a bad way to draw up a tax. To tax the unfortunate, I don't necessarily think is the right way that the Treasury should be bringing things together. You asked the question earlier about what the threshold should be, and there's some discussion about what that might be. I think a straight threshold is probably the wrong way to do it. If what you want to do is stop people investing in farmland to avoid inheritance tax, then what you'd want instead is some sort of clawback, so that you had a relief that applied on sale and deferred the tax, and if you remained in farming for, say, a decade, that tax bill went down by 10% per annum. The person who's just inherited it because they want money will sell it because they can make a much better rate of return on the stock market. The person who is doing it because they're a farmer and that's all that they know how to live their life, they'll keep it and then they won't be impacted by the tax. That's the sort of law that I was expecting they might try and bring in to attack this sort of tax avoidance strategy. It's not what we've seen.
And then,